Hi, this is Anna, Imagination the Healing Garden. Welcome to Shifting Perspectives. And if you are new to my channel, I am a philosopher, psychologist, sociologist of 30 years. So I do a lot of work. In fact, all of my work is perspective philosophy, perspective psychology. And one of my persons in my community asked the question, how do you communicate with somebody who's at a different perspective? So a little bit of a recap. This is how this works. There are 12 perspectives. And there are variations of each perspective. Within each perspective, you have 12 mini perspectives with each perspective. It's extraordinarily awesome. Once you know the 12 perspectives, you'll understand that each and every person, each and every child, no matter their age, race, culture, all of it, is at a different stage of growth. These are spiral dynamics, first introduced by Dr. Graves. His research takes you up to the eighth perspective. It kind of like he gives you the first six solid perspectives, and then his work definitely has the seventh and eighth perspective, and then it's just eight plus. My work continues all the way to the 12th perspectives. So here's, and basically, according to Dr. Graves, you can only retain, and I have found this to be valid, you can only retain three perspectives at a time. Basic memory loss, basic perspective. And basically, this is it. The conversation began with the question that she posed. I'm afraid that as I grow, I'm going to lose friends. This is the number one reason why people avoid growth, is because we are not taught that it's safe to grow. Our perspectives are abused as children through our whole lives. Even right now, we have so much perspective abuse going on. And basically, it's not safe to have a different perspective. It's assumed, and societal expectation is that there is one perspective and we all have to obey the one perspective, which is the fourth perspective. And as a result, if you don't behave according to the fourth perspective's expectations, people get abused. So you have a lot of sixth perspectives who don't agree with the fourth perspectives because they've grown from the fourth perspective, and they are abused. They are some of the most significantly abused people because they are very much not conforming to the expectations of the fourth perspective. So we were pulling this apart, and I was explaining to her that what her fear expressed, what she expressed was basically what I call a perspective gap, which is what Dr. Graves introduced in his work with spiral dynamics back in the 70s. So the further along you get between each perspective, the more of a gap that you have between each individual. The gap goes to the point where if you are, and you're only limited to three perspectives. It's why we cannot remember what it was like to be a baby, is because the perspective gap is too big. A 1-year-old is at the first perspective. A 2-year-old is at the second perspective. A 3-year-old is at the third perspective. A fourth child, a 4-year-old is at the fourth perspective. And it's usually around here that we all stop growing because it's not safe to grow. It's not safe to evolve. It's not safe to be different. So the society pretty much stalls out at the second, third, and fourth perspective. Our political parties are Republicans, third perspective, Democrats, fourth perspective. Entrepreneurs who are leaning more toward that conservative conservation ecosystem, now you're getting into the fifth perspective. Hippies are a solid sixth perspective, and that is your Green Party. They are the ones mostly responsible for the Green Party, and the environmentalists, that's your sixth perspective. Just to give you a lineup. So our government, our two-party system, is actually only acknowledging two of the 12 perspectives, which is the problem with the government. But that's a different topic. So here's how this works. If you are a fourth perspective, you are going to be able to communicate with the third perspective without a problem and the fifth perspective. But people in the fourth perspective and higher do not respect or admire or want growth. They value comfort. And because they internalize, basically they internalize a person's growth as a deliberate rejection of them. So then they internalize that advancement of growth, and they feel like it's an abandonment or a rejection, so they lash out. So they view a person's growth as an attack or a rejection of themselves because they haven't learned boundaries. You don't learn boundaries until you get to the eighth perspective. You can learn them prematurely, but it's going to be really hard for you. When you get to the eighth perspective, that's when you learn communication. That's when you learn boundaries, which is why so many of us are so stunted when it comes to communication, which is actually the major topic I'm talking about today. So when you get that perspective gap happening, basically how to communicate with other perspectives, you have to basically How do I do it? Let me break this down because I know how to do it. I just never really put it into words before. I know what they prioritize. I know what they value. So it's a knowledge of it's knowing what the priority and the value of each perspective is. And then it's understanding and being very patient with the acceptance that these are just stages of growth. There's no competition, there's no hierarchy, there's no people are less than, people are more than. It's not a hierarchy status, it's just a stage of growth. And once you understand, and this is not a well, it very much is a education versus uneducated, but that's again stage of growth. The more educated you become intellectually, the more advanced you become along the stages of growth, the more you evolve. But as you evolve, you lose abilities to do things over here. So it's actually very much an ecosystem of perspective. That's it right there. There is an ecosystem of perspectives. There are things that I cannot do. I'm a 12th perspective and I cannot do them. I have to hire fourth and fifth perspectives to do certain jobs because I can't. I have to hire second and third perspectives to do the jobs that I can't. Likewise, they have to hire people who are seventh, eighth, and ninth perspective to do the jobs they can't. So it's very much an ecosystem. We're very much symbiotic, not parasitic, not codependent. We are symbiotic. And once you understand that each perspective provides its own symbiosis, oh, that's when you start working together and that's when things happen. Right now, the majority of our society is at conflict, competition, there's combativeness, there's aggression, there's a lot of misunderstanding going on because they don't tolerate the different perspectives. Once you get to the understanding of these 12 perspectives, things change. So, symbiotic. When you understand each of the perspectives and you understand the qualifiers of each perspective, when you speak to whichever perspective you're speaking to, you know what they value, where they are. You also know your perspective and you preserve your perspective. So you want to use your boundaries in place so that they don't violate your perspective. Likewise, you also do not want to violate theirs. It's equivalent to a teacher speaking to a student. Now, eliminate age. Think only in terms of perspective. If you have a teacher and that teacher is being condescending to the student is not going to trust. They're going to shut down and they're going to reject the teacher. So you have to have patience. You have to have understanding. Oh, you have to have a lot of compassion. You need empathy. You also need to understand the values of that perspective, the qualifiers of their perspective. And you need to know which perspective you are talking to so that you know which qualifiers you need to address. For instance, I'm a 12th perspective. So when I speak to somebody, in fact, this morning I was speaking to a gun lover, which tells me he was a third perspective, fourth perspective, 100% third perspective. So I know that as a third perspective, that is somebody who does not or has not yet learned how to integrate dependence with interdependence. The value of, and I'm going to pull this apart, why a person values guns is because they don't trust other people. The reason why they don't trust other people is because they're stuck at the third perspective and they have not learned yet how to trust other people. So they feel threatened often because they don't know how to use boundaries, because that's not something you learn until the eighth perspective. So they don't feel like they can protect themselves. They don't trust themselves and they don't trust other people, which is the entire core of the third perspective. As a result, they use guns, violence, aggression as a means to protect themselves because they don't trust that they can protect themselves. Now, I know this. So when I sit down and talk to a third perspective, it is highly important that you approach them with gentleness, open-mindedness, and there is a high probability that they are going to take what you say defensively because they have not learned the core ethics of trusting other people, invalidation, and also the integration of dependence and interdependence. Now, here's the problem with that. We're supposed to learn that ethic at 3 years old. But if you have a 45 or a 55-year-old person who has not yet learned that ethic, first, that means that something went wrong when they were 3 years old. There's a reason why we were supposed to learn it at 3. And here this person is now at 55 years old and they love their guns. which tells me that we're looking at about 3 decades of reaffirmed belief, reaffirmed confirmation that you can't trust anybody, which means this person is not a 3-year-old who hasn't learned how to integrate. They have 3 decades of, I can't trust anybody. That is somebody who is highly offended, highly aggressive, highly, they don't trust themselves to judge people properly. They don't trust themselves to keep themselves safe. So they need the gun as a means to protect themselves and keep themselves safe because they feel threatened quite often. So when you're talking to a third perspective, the best thing to do is to show them that you mean well, that you mean to be a friend. This is a big part of all of the perspectives. This is where you get into the psychology of community building. The first thing you want to do is offer a gift or offer some sort of a peace offering, which is why we have peace offerings, is because you want to show that you are not a threat. You want to show respect. Respect is a really big part of this. How a person views respect is going to be different depending upon each perspective. So that if you're talking to a third perspective, what they view as respect is going to be completely different. Now, this person was speaking in terms like we and us. He thought I was one of them because we were both Americans in this conversation. He was a Texan. I'm a New Yorker. I am a sixth. Well, I'm a 12th perspective. He's a third perspective. So he thought because we were Americans that we were like each other. So he was absolutely happy about the gun and how the camaraderie. We were actually talking about the book Frankenstein because there's a cowboy with a gun-loving American in the book Frankenstein. Yes, there is. And somebody was like, "Oh my God, there's a cowboy," and we're like, "Yes, the American with a gun. That's the cowboy." And the Texan was like, "Yeah, absolutely," and he was very gun ho, "Yay, guns!" And I'm like, "Yeah, I am a pacifist. I am an anarchist, a feminist." Like, so I was showing him this is my perspective. This is where I'm at. But I was making sure that I was using language to show him, I grew up in a gun shop. I am very familiar with gun etiquette, gun law. I'm quite familiar with it. And I'm a pacifist. I believe that forced perspective, forced violence and aggression to show persons a point of view is not the best way to go about with something. I believe in communication and problem solving with mutual interests in mind. That's 12th perspective. Now, I made sure that I was very respectful when I spoke to him. I made sure that my language was deliberately non-confrontational and gentle because this is somebody who has had an entire lifetime believing that he can't trust people. So that's one example of when you're talking to a third perspective. If you're talking to a second perspective, they are going to be really focused on their tribal leader, their union worker, their religion, their teachers, their cultures. They're going to have somebody that they idolize, and that person is going to be the all be all end all of their law and rule. And they're going to idolize that person. And to threaten or to make fun of or to mock that person or that belief is going to create a highly defensive person. So really respect is a good chunk of this. Understanding which perspective is at what so you understand what you're dealing with. Dealing with how best to proceed with the conversation. If you have a fourth perspective, you know that they're probably going to be political. They are probably going to be, well, you got to follow the rules. Well, you got to conform. And these, of all the perspectives, the fourth perspective is the most closed-minded. And that is just part of their stage of growth. They understand if they have learned the first 3 ethics effectively, properly, if they've internalized them, this is somebody who might have a no problem with self-nurturing. They can manage their own emotions. This is somebody who might know their own resourcefulness. And this is somebody who might have learned how to integrate dependence and dependence and independence so that they are interdependent. And they might just not have, they have not yet learned how to self-govern. They don't know that they can self-govern, or they haven't learned yet to trust their self-governing skills. So when you're talking to a fourth perspective, they're going to be highly dependent upon law, order, the government. They're going to think the government is great because they haven't learned yet how to live independently from the government. They have not yet separated government from the self. And as a result, they're going to be highly dependent upon the government. So to threaten the government or their political point of view is going to literally be a threat to their individuality. And that's now it's when you're talking to somebody who's fourth perspective. And if they're very aggressive and very assertive about this is the government and this is, we should do this and, God bless America, all that jazz. Now you're looking at somebody who gets their security from their political position. which means if you threaten their security with laughter, with mockery, with aggression, this is somebody who's going to become aggressive and fight back, whether verbally, assertively, or if they are passive, they will withdraw, they will internalize what you say, and that could very well affect their mental health, which is why it's very important that you speak respectfully to people and mind which perspective they are in. If they are in the fifth perspective, they might still be cleaning to that fourth perspective point of view of the government is it. They're also dealing with people, this is very common with fifth perspectives, where they're starting to realize and become aware of their mental health. You don't start thinking about your mental health until you're in the fifth perspective. That is really when you shift the priority to, I need to be accountable for my own mental health. Now, they may not be there yet. They might be approaching that, which means they might start to notice that their mental health is not prime. They might start to notice that they have mental issues. They may not have started to do anything about it. Fourth perspectives may try to do something about their mental health, but they haven't prioritized it because their priority is still them thinking that they can't self-govern. Self-government and accountability are required for mental health development, for mental health healing, specifically self-government. Accountability is where you're on that cusp. This is the fifth perspective, where you haven't quite assumed full responsibility for your own abuse. You might still have the victim mindset, which is very prevalent right up until the fifth perspective because you haven't learned accountability. So people who are in the first five perspectives are very much in the victim mindset because they're not held accountable for their abuse. And this is really the bitter, hardcore pill to swallow. Once you learn accountability, you realize that you are 100% responsible for all of your abuse. Now you have to deal with that. And this is where a lot of people who pass from the fifth perspective over to the sixth perspective, there is I'm going to call it a rite of passage. Best way I can explain it. When you cross from the fifth perspective over to the sixth perspective, you have to really swallow a humble pill. You have to accept it, and you do. It's not have to, you do accept it. This is accountability. This is the ethic you learn at the fifth perspective. So at the end of the fifth perspective, everybody who goes from fifth to sixth perspective has two realizations. One, I am responsible for the abuse that I allowed to my person. B, I am responsible and accountable for the abuse I caused other people. Now, not everybody can handle those two realizations. And this is where you see a massive traumatic, it shakes your core. My God, does it shake your core? But you're not going to proceed with proper healing until you internalize these two lessons and you learn to deal with it. This is the judgment of the sixth perspective. It is the trial. Every perspective has their own trial, and this is the trial of the sixth perspective. It's when you finally receive these 2 points of reality, what you have done to yourself and what you have done to other people. And now you've got to learn how to manage that, live with it, and cope with it. And you don't pass on to the seventh perspective until you pass this trial. It is the self-forgiveness. Literally, self-forgiveness is very much the moral to be learned at the sixth perspective. And if you don't learn self-forgiveness and put yourself on the same pedestal with other people, you're not going to pass into the seventh perspective, which is why so many people do not make it out of the seventh perspective. So you see a lot of stall out at the fourth perspective. You see a lot of stall out at the sixth perspective. Now, the flip side of all this is the sixth perspective, in addition to having to learn self-forgiveness, and they've just learned accountability, they've also accepted a new ethic at the sixth perspective, early sixth perspective, which is, oh my God, my behavior affects other people. So you're suddenly taking on this massive responsibility burden of how you affect other people. So the sixth perspective is really a trial by fire of accepting the self-forgiveness. Now, if you don't have the first perspective in place, you are going to burn and it's not going to go well. I see so many people who get to the sixth perspective immediately go to alcohol, they go to substance abuse, they go to self-abuse. It's really bad. And it's because they lack the first perspective that's going to get them through the sixth perspective. So if you are not armed and at the ready and armored up with that first and second and third perspective, by the time you get to the sixth, you can see a massive setback. I have seen people who move from the sixth perspective onto the seventh perspective without internalizing the sixth perspective completely or properly. And that plunges them into such severe isolation because seventh perspective is all about learning silence, learning observation, learning listening. Stepping into the seventh perspective is literally like becoming an infant again. So is the 12th perspective. The 12th perspective also is like walking into infancy again. It's extraordinary. So you have the first, the seventh, and the 12th perspective, all very much like sitting at infancy all over again. It is a time for observation, silence, and just bringing in all of this data to assess where your life is and who you are. And if you have not made peace with yourself through self-forgiveness at that sixth perspective, you're not going to be okay. So really, it's understanding how each of these perspectives values, prioritizes, what exactly is involved at each perspective. Is it simple to learn? Yes. So I'm going to pause here for just a minute and set aside from this. The words easy, simple, hard, complex. These are 4 words that we use a lot. And if not used properly, they are gaslighting. If it's easy or hard, solid gaslight, no question asked. Easy and hard equals gaslighting because easy and hard is 100% your perspective or my perspective. For me, psychology is so freaking easy. For other people, psychology is really hard. So to say to somebody, what's the problem? It's really easy is actually a solid, hardcore gaslight. And that very much basically implies that the person is incompetent or stupid. So to say the words easy or hard is really, if you're going to use the words, make sure you clarify for me. But now you're looking into comparisons. Well, for me, it was easy. For you, it was hard. There's really no easy way to, or no simple way to slice this. The 2 words, easy and hard, very much equate to gaslighting. Now, complex and simple actually are synonym. These are words that have nothing to do with easy and hard, but we use the word simple to equal easy when it's not. Simple does not mean easy, and complex does not mean hard. Simple means 1, maybe 2 steps. Complex means 10 steps, maybe 15 steps. That's it. So really, in my mind, psychology is simple. There's like 2, 3 steps. And we see this with Newton's in truth there is simplicity, which means when you get closer to truth, things become more and more broken down into simple steps. And that's very true. It's how you know you're on something. If something is complex, it's because we're making it complicated because we're not seeing the big picture. But when you see the big picture of something, it becomes real condensed, real simple. That being said, easy and hard is how a person perceives their ability or inability to do something efficiently. I had one of my mentors was huge on telling me how easy it is to make money, how easy it is to change your business over into a money generator. Now, for me, it's been very difficult, very, very difficult. And for me, it was very, very complex to break down all the moving parts psychologically to figure out the right formula to get the right people coming to me. And I felt like an idiot the entire time because my mentor kept saying, "Oh, it's so easy." She didn't mean to. This is somebody who is completely unaware that easy is a gaslight. So, just something I wanted to really clarify is when I say it's simple, I am referring to there's only 1 or 2 steps. So, if you are interested in learning how to communicate with a different perspective, there's only four steps really to learn. And once you understand the 4 steps and you can break down those 4 steps with all 12 perspectives, you know which one to move in. Now, here's an easier way of doing it. If I were to break it down easier, here's a simpler way of doing this. If I were to break it down into even fewer steps. The question you really need to ask is about authority, power, control. Is this, is the person I am speaking to at a stage of growth that is less than mine or more than mine? If they are less than yours, then you need to humble yourself and assume the role of student. And if they are wiser than you, if they are more advanced along the stages of growth than you, then become a student. This is where you want to take advantage of their knowledge and ask questions. And as a student to somebody who is, but the motive is what's different. In either case, you want to ask questions. You want to assume the role of student, but the difference is this: if you are talking to somebody who is not as who is in a smaller stage of growth than you, in order to communicate with them, you want to be sure that to respect their perspective, that you ask questions to basically learn their perspective. But you're doing it to keep yourself in check. On the flip side of this, you're not doing it to keep yourself in check. You're doing it to obtain information for your own growth. So on this side of it, you're not looking to grow. You are looking to understand their perspective. On this side of it, you're looking to grow. So on this side of it, you really are the student. On this side of it, you are assuming the role of student to preserve their authority or their disadvantage. A person who has authority has advantage. The person who does not have authority has disadvantage. So the only way to balance out a conversation or an interaction with anybody who is at a disadvantage, the person with authority has to assume the role of disadvantage by asking question, by assuming the student. So if you have a parent and a child, if you have a parent in their creation, the parent should, to preserve the child's own power, authority, while they learn and grow, the best parents will assume the role of student and ask the child questions as if they were children or students, so that the child is given authority to make the decision. Now, we're talking a child. So if the child does something that is legitimately dangerous, the parent at any time can override the child's decision and gently guide them. However, on a day-to-day basis over gentle things, simple subjects like, what do you want for dinner? The child asks, what's for dinner? What would you like for dinner? Things like that. And let the child be zany with their solutions. I want ice cream for dinner. What do you think that would happen if I gave you ice cream? Let's talk about that. And when you take the role of student, you are basically providing a safe psychological place for the child to explore and psychologically examine consequence, and they might come up with something real crazy out there, like, and I shouldn't say crazy, that's gaslighting. They might extraordinary or abnormal or abstract. They might come up with something really imaginative and abstract. Ooh, I like that, using imaginative and abstract instead of crazy. Imaginative and abstract that we would never think about, like, hey, let's do that. That sounds good, actually. So allow the child space for imagination and abstractness. Now, flipping that around, if you are at the disadvantage and it's the teacher, you have somebody who's at a higher perspective, you really want to take advantage of that person's perspective because they have information and insight that you lack. It's one of my favorite things to do with a person is always ask them, no matter what their perspective is, what do you enjoy talking about? Because it automatically puts you in a position where you can be curious. They're either going to bring up a topic you know nothing about, which now, because you're in a student position, you can ask and inquire and learn and grow. Or they're going to bring up a topic that they know and that you are already familiar with. And as a result, you can enjoy. So either way, it's a win-win. And they are now comfortable talking about something that they are comfortable with. So I know they're comfortable with this conversation. So that now that I'm in a student role, I can just absorb and learn. So really, the best way to communicate with all the different perspectives is by assuming the role of a student. No matter what, become a student. If you are speaking to somebody who is a perspective lower than you, you are the student to empower them. You are the student to empower them. And if they are at a perspective higher than you, you are a student to learn and grow from them. And those are your options. Always become a student, always ask questions. Always listen to learn, not to respond. Listen to learn. You learned that at the seventh perspective, by the way. If you love shit like this, like, subscribe, follow, comment below. Let me know what part of the show resonated with you. And if you want to learn more about me and what the projects that I'm doing, click on the link below and click change now. Thank you so much. And may the kindest of words always find you.